Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, it's the last episode in our series about historical counterfactuals, the big what-ifs. And to mark the 10th anniversary of the Scottish independence referendum, I'm talking to the historian of Scotland and Scottish nationalism, Ben Jackson, about what might have happened if Scotland, 10 years ago, had voted yes to independence. Ben, with these counterfactuals, there are usually two questions, certainly are in this case. So the first is, could it have come out differently? And we'll talk about that. And then the second is, if it had come out differently, what sort of a world would we be living in now? But I think, first of all, we need to talk about the referendum itself and whether there could have been a different result. And I'm conflicted on this because I have a confused historical memory of this event 10 years ago, almost to the day, which is, I seem to remember feeling it was close. And the campaign felt at various points quite knife edge, particularly the last week. There was the notorious YouGov poll the weekend before the vote, which was for the first time suggested that the campaign for independence might be in the lead. And there was some panic around that, which we'll come on to. And yet the result wasn't that close. 55-45, slightly more than 55 voting for Scotland to remain in the Union, slightly under 45% voting for independence. That's not a close result. What's your memory of it? And with historical hindsight, are you comfortable at all with the idea that this was close, this was something that could have gone a different way, or am I pushing it by trying to get this into the counterfactual column?
My memory is similar to yours. The sort of experiential dimension of the referendum for the people who were in the mix of it and people who were watching it was that it was incredibly exciting and very, very tight towards the end. And as you say, there were these polls that seemed to show yes ahead. I think at one point, according to the reporting anyway, in Downing Street, they had a private poll that showed yes ahead, which is partly what sparked the UK government into action towards the end. And so there definitely was a sense of a fluidity in the electorate, that things were up for grabs. And the striking thing about the result as it washed out is that there had been a massive increase in support for independence throughout the course of the campaign. So maybe at the start of the campaign or a few months before the campaign, probably about a third maybe of the electorate said they were in favour of independence, and they'd got it to 45% by the end. So there was obviously a huge swing in opinion during the campaign. I think that accounts for part of that sense of excitement. Thinking about what might have been different, I think even though there was that 10-point gap, I think that sense of fluidity in the electorate suggests that maybe different campaigns, less well-run campaigns on the no side, or maybe slightly different circumstances, tweaking the circumstances, could have resulted in a yes vote. In the sense that I think a lot of the public opinion polling shows that there was an interest and a curiosity about the idea of independence across a lot of the electorate, and what stopped some people voting was a sense of risk aversion and a sense of the unknown.
And with hindsight, we can do the comparison with Brexit, because it is really striking when we know what happened 2 years later, how in a way this one does look more contingent again. And I have two feelings about this, one of which is, I do remember at the time there was a conventional wisdom, which is that the electorate in a campaign like this are quite change curious, and that comes out during the campaign, possibly even in the polls. But the status quo has a tendency to exert an iron grip on the day itself. And there was a feeling that in the end, the status quo almost always prevails when it's a leap into the unknown. So that was a conventional wisdom in 2014. It was not the conventional wisdom by the end of 2016. Brexit plus Trump was enough to make people feel that the leap into the unknown is completely possible at the end of one of these campaigns. So that's one difference. It's almost as though it was a little early in the wider electoral willingness in a whole range of different electorates to take the plunge. And maybe in 2016, in that climate, it would have been different. And then the other really striking point of comparison for me is that the Brexit referendum campaign didn't spell out in a great deal of detail what Brexit would mean, notoriously, actually. Whereas in the Scottish independence campaign, there was an awful lot of focus in the campaign itself on the practicalities of independence. How is this going to work, particularly around economic questions, currency questions, but constitutional questions too, of the kind that you almost feel, had it been a Brexit-style campaign, a little bit more wishful, independence could easily have won. So, the Brexit comparison to me makes me feel, with hindsight, it was pretty contingent.
Yeah, I think with thinking about how the Yes campaign could have been run differently, I suppose there's two ways it could have been done differently. So one would be, as you say, to run a more Brexit-style campaign, which would be much less detailed and specific about what they were going to do. I guess the other option I was thinking about was, could they have run an even more sort of sober and reassuring campaign that could have won over the sort of risk-averse voters who didn't make the plunge for Yes?
Could they have reassured them on the currency question, for instance? So that's the one that seems like the big barrier. With Brexit, there wasn't a currency question. And we know that in other European countries, member states of the Eurozone, the big barrier in the way of people being pissed off with the EU wanting to get out is the currency question feels insuperable. And it did feel a little bit like there wasn't, in the end, a persuasive answer to the question of, the choices were keep the pound, that's not satisfactory, join the euro, that was difficult. Scotland having its own currency, that looked very precarious. That one did look like a big barrier.
Yeah, I think those stakes in the Scottish referendum campaign obviously seemed much more immediate and tangible to the electorate than in the Brexit campaign, when the Remain campaign obviously found it much harder to get across what the economic stakes were or make them seem sort of legible in people's everyday lives. Whereas I think that exactly this question of what's the currency going to be was a very clear one that had all sorts of implications for people's everyday lives. Whether they could have done more to reassure on it, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, it is they were stuck on a dilemma between choosing the option they did choose, which was the idea of a union with sterling, which then ends up handing a lot of power over to the government in London, choosing a Scottish currency, which entails enormous disruption, or going for the euro, which, maybe if we were to try and tweak the circumstances a bit, maybe if there hadn't been a euro crisis or the euro crisis had washed out in a different way, then maybe the Scottish National Party would have stuck with the idea of Scotland being in the euro, which had actually been their position until relatively late on in the independence debate, when I think they sensed that the way the euro crisis was going meant that it wasn't going to be possible to run with that. So a more favourable climate for the euro, I guess, in terms of the political argument, might have then enabled them to say Scotland's going to be in the euro. Of course, that then raises all sorts of further questions about whether they'd be able to do that. But at least that would be a kind of economic model you could point to. You could say, well, look, that's what Ireland does. It works for Ireland. Why wouldn't it work for Scotland? So I guess that would be one way of doing it. I mean, I suppose the other thought just about the Brexit parallel is one of the interesting things about the Yes support is that demographically it's a bit different from the coalition that makes up the pro-Brexit coalition, in the sense that the Yes vote in Scotland is much more geared towards younger voters who've actually got a lot of higher education or, higher levels of education, and whereas it's the older voters in Scotland who tended to vote no to independence. And I don't know whether, it could be that if you're trying to build a coalition that's made up of working age people who've got a lot more economic skin in the game, I guess, in terms of mortgages and all those kinds of things, whether it's that kind of risk aversion argument can disrupt your coalition much more than if you have the kind of Brexit coalition, which a lot of political scientists say was sort of somewhat economically insulated from the effects of the Brexit vote, or had, relatively stable pensions, didn't have mortgages, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, because you could say the other obvious difference with the Brexit vote and the Scottish vote is that there were people with living memories of Britain not having been in the European Union. It was a 50-year story. And there was a way, at least, of presenting Brexit as an undoing of something that hadn't become completely entrenched. I think that was a fallacy. I think one of the skills of the Brexit campaign was to suggest that this thing could be relatively painlessly unraveled, in the sense that something had been added on to Britain's political and constitutional arrangements that could be removed, leaving the status quo in place. So then the status quo could almost be presented as the thing that you're going to get if you can remember a status quo from 50 years ago. But the Union of England and Scotland, never mind what followed it, is not something that anyone could remember what predated that. And there was a day after question in the Scottish independence campaign, which was quite pressing. Questions about the border between England and Scotland, questions about the currency, questions about the constitutional arrangement. They wouldn't have to be answered the next day, but they would become acute the next day. And then the thought of the economic consequences creating uncertainty and possibly even panic. And the British state having to bail out the newly independent Scottish state from any conditions of panic. it did feel different in that respect, because we probably need an explanation of why the status quo seemed like the less risk-averse option in this case relative to the Brexit case. And it just did feel like, I do remember at the time, some of those day after questions having teeth. And the Remain campaign tried to give them teeth in the Brexit case, but just didn't succeed. We can see why they didn't succeed, because the day after the world didn't end. And I presume the day after, we'll come on to this, the day after a vote for Scottish independence, the world also wouldn't have ended. But in the campaign itself, it did feel like the next day questions really had bite.
Yeah, it's a much deeper, longer lasting union, so many more things to unpick. It would have been incredibly complicated to do that. And I think that was something that voters were conscious of during the campaign. There was, in a way, it was much more ventilated in more detail than it was during the Brexit campaign. And there was much more political engagement by the electorate in the campaign in Scotland. I mean, it ended up with a turnout of 85%, which, was sort of unprecedented in terms of the level of turnout. So there was a real sense that everyone was talking and thinking about these issues. I guess one thing that was very striking about that, though, was that you would think that this deep, long-lasting, centuries-long union would generate forms of sentimental attachment that could be appealed to by the No campaign. And I think one of the startling things that quickly became apparent during the campaign was that didn't really work. Those kind of sentimental appeals to Britishness or British identity didn't actually land with the electorate. So the No campaign did a lot of opinion polling before the campaign started. And what they found was there was basically a third of the electorate who were very pro-independence, a third who did feel quite British and were very pro-union, but there was a third in the middle who were the swing voters who were not at all moved by appeals to Britishness, but were moved by appeals to possible economic losses, the difficulties of the transition, all of these things that we've been talking about. So I suppose another counterfactual scenario might be a less adroit No campaign that tried to focus more on ideas about Britishness, that ended up getting into an argument about Britishness versus Scottishness, that foregrounded English conservative politicians as the figureheads of the No campaign, rather than the Scottish figures who represented the No campaign, like Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling. I think you could imagine that would be to the advantage of the Yes campaign. In a way, that was what the Yes campaign wanted. At one point, Alex Salmond challenged David Cameron to a debate, and wisely, David Cameron declined that invitation. Instead, Alistair Darling debated Alex Salmond. So it's sort of interesting that there's this very deep union, but it's not one that had sort of generated forms of sentimental attachment. It was the economic costs that the No campaign focused on in a laser-like fashion and received an enormous amount of criticism for doing. Everyone said this is a terrible, negative campaign. But actually, I think in retrospect, that was the campaign to run. That was the winning campaign. They were right to do that in kind of pure realpolitik terms, but it wasn't a very edifying, uplifting experience. It was basically saying, you might think things are bad now, but they'll be even worse if Scotland becomes independent.
And that's symbolised in some ways by Gordon Brown himself, because as a politician, he invested quite a lot of intellectual and political capital in the idea of Britishness. It was one of the things he was associated with as a Scottish UK Prime Minister. But at the end of the campaign, he came to symbolise the move to what I think is now known as the vow or the pledge, which was right at the end of the campaign when the panic buttons were hit in Downing Street. And a commitment was made in the final few days to greater Scottish devolution in the event of a no vote. And Gordon Brown came out with that first. I think the sequence was he sort of floated these ideas after that weekend poll, and then Cameron and Clegg and Miliband signed some bogus document which appeared on the front of the newspapers under the heading of The Vow, which was, it was panicky, but it seems also to have been quite effective, which was to say, don't think that if Scotland remains in the UK, that is simply a vote for things as they are. There will be movement towards greater devolution. But Brown, who was thought to have had a good campaign, I think, and have played quite an important role, but he was at the heart of that too. He gave up on the Britishness line and very much went for the pragmatic line.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there was a kind of nuance in what Gordon Brown was saying, is that he moved away from, as you say, what had been his previous attempts at Britishness, which had been an attempt to conjure up values and sort of impressionistic sort of historical moments that represented Britishness. And he pivoted more towards a left of centre account of Britishness, which said Britain is a social union, it's a welfare state, it's about sharing risks and pooling resources. And it was that kind of centre-left Labour message that he tried to drive, so that if independence comes about, you're going to be jeopardising pensions, the public services, all of those kinds of things. And he coupled that with an offer of further powers to the Scottish Parliament. It's always a bit difficult to unpick the causation with these things about how much these electoral initiatives actually make a difference to outcomes. So as I understand it, the political scientists are sceptical that this vow did actually make much of a difference to the vote in the end. I think because they think that if you track public opinion, that the swing away from yes had actually already started before the vow appeared on the newspapers. And the UK politicians who were making this vow were in any case not very trusted by the Scottish electorate. I mean, on the other hand, it clearly did take up a lot of political airtime in the latter stages of the campaign. So I think you could argue the fact that No had a political initiative it was putting on the table did prevent the Yes side getting across some of their closing messages and focusing on the issues that they wanted to talk about. So in that sense, the latter stages of the debate ended up being preoccupied with this question of more powers to the Scottish Parliament and whether that was adequate. And so in that sense, you could say it was strategically successful for the No side because it knocked the other side off their game.
Before we come on to what might have followed the day after, the years after, had Scotland voted for independence, there are a couple more thoughts that I had about the campaign itself. So one is the point that you made in comparison with Brexit, which was there was a lot of support for independence among younger voters relative to older voters. And it was the other way around. With the Brexit referendum, famously, if you only had one question to ask a voter and you had to try and work out how they voted, the question you should ask is, how old are you? Either did you go to university or how old are you? And it's kind of reversed in the Scottish case. And that plays into a basic fact of contemporary democratic life that older voters tend to win because there are more of them. It's just, in aging societies, it is an uphill battle to win an election when the basis of your coalition is young. Now, I don't know how far young stretched in this case. And clearly, it's not just all older people wanted to stay in the UK and all younger people wanted to leave, but there was quite a striking correlation there. Do you think there was a case for saying, and this has been true of many campaigns that have started with a lot of enthusiasm among the young, but have fizzled out because they just get outvoted by the old, that the real challenge to overcome here was with those older voters, in the sense that the younger voters were not enough, and therefore you did probably need a different kind of approach to this. This is in a series of votes where I'm thinking of Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party, in other cases too, where you need older people on your side or you just can't get over the line.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it would have been helpful if they'd been able to cut the margin among older people, because it is the older age group, I think, that was the most significant no vote. I mean, if you basically look at any demographic group in Scotland, apart from older people, you get a very high yes vote, not necessarily over 50%, but, certainly knocking up through the 40s and in some cases into the 50s. And so cutting that margin would have helped. Of course, that probably is the electorate who had most of a sense of a kind of British national consciousness, or had memories that kind of stretched back to, back beyond Thatcherism, basically. I mean, a lot of the framing of these debates in the independence referendum was about, everything went wrong with Thatcherism, and there was an sort of undemocratic imposition of Thatcherism on Scotland, and this is a sort of chance to escape from that kind of Conservative government that Scotland doesn't vote for. And I guess those groups maybe had a longer historical timescale in which to think about Britishness and sort of legacy of the Second World War and all of those kinds of things that people who advocated a more emotionally rooted no campaign were keen on talking about. I mean, I guess there still was scope for Yes to grow its support among the working age population, though they could still have done better there. And in that sense, maybe that's where the No campaign was very successful in holding down that vote, because I think the polling does show that a lot of those people were at least curious or interested in independence, not at all averse to it. But then when the sort of financial reckoning became plain, they sort of recoiled from making the final choice.
And how much was the Yes campaign tied to the SNP and to people's attitudes to the SNP? Now, there were a series of elections, including the following general election, where the SNP did amazingly well, won 56, I think, of the 59 Scottish seats. But the SNP has never been a 50% plus party in Scottish politics. It seems to top out at about 45%, which coincidentally is where the Yes campaign topped out in the referendum. To what extent was the campaign, even back then, I mean, when the SNP was riding high, which it is not now, but this was close to the high watermark of SNP popularity in Scotland, I think, and the SNP had become the party of government in Scotland. How much was the tie to the SNP a barrier to getting over the line?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so in one way, the SNP were quite successful in building a campaign that broadened out from the institution of the party. Clearly, it was the SNP who were driving the strategy and really making a lot of the decisions, but they created a sort of permission structure within which there was a flowering of lots of different campaign groups. And there was definitely a sense in civil society during the campaign that the campaign had kind of outrun the boundaries of what the SNP presented. So you had other political parties who advocated independence, notably the Scottish Green Party, which came to the fore, but also all sorts of pressure groups that kind of organised around independence and were out there campaigning. So I think in one sense, you could say the Yes campaign was successful in getting beyond the institutional confines of that one party. I think on the other hand, it's possible some of that campaigning was a bit of a double-edged sword sometimes in that they didn't always have control over what those campaigns were doing and saying. And certainly in the minds of some people who voted no, I think some of the sort of the exuberance and sort of energy of those campaigns actually turned off some voters who there was a big mobilization, in the streets effectively in the weeks running into the vote. There was, flags everywhere, marches, all sorts of things happening, which was very, very exciting for the people who were on the Yes side. And for people on the Yes side, this was a sort of festival of democracy and they really enjoyed it. But for the people on the No side, it was much more emotionally enervating. And I sort of almost wonder if a more disciplined Yes campaign that had been able to rein in some of its supporters might have been able to win over some of those more cautious voters. So there was, towards the end, there was a lot of stuff about things that went beyond the bounds of normal democratic discourse, basically, both online and on the streets of, the Labour MP, Jim Murphy, had been doing this campaign of kind of street speeches, and there were people turning up to barrack him, and he kind of had to suspend his campaign because he was worried about the atmosphere around his campaign. So that kind of thing created a sense that maybe this isn't the most sober campaign that it could be in the minds of some no voters. So I think it is possible that at least a slightly less exuberant Yes campaign might have been able to win over more of those swing voters.
And to do one more comparison with Brexit, and this one is difficult because it's a painful counterfactual anyway, but one of the things about the Brexit campaign is the event that marked the campaign was the murder of Joe Cox. And there was then a suspension, essentially, of a lot of the heat and energy around the campaign. And at the time, there was a feeling that this would remind people of the stakes and this new era of sobriety would favour Remain. But actually, in the end, I think it favoured Leave. I think that some of what you've described, which is the ways in which the wilder version of the case for the unknown frightens people and puts people off, there was something about the sort of lowering of the temperature in the final week of the Brexit campaign that really benefited Leave. I don't really know how to unpick it because it's sort of a horrible irony. And what you've just described suggests to me that the reverse was true in this case too. There is something odd about trying to persuade people to leap into the unknown because you want to enthuse them, but you don't want to over-enthuse them because the unknown is scary. And it is a delicate balancing act. And maybe you're right in the Scottish case, the unnerving aspect in the end predominated. And somehow with Brexit, it didn't. There are other reasons we've mentioned that there was less discussion about what it would mean and so on. But it is an interesting point of comparison that, to get people to do the thing that for some of the older voters might frighten them, you almost need the heat to be sucked out of the campaign.
Yeah, I think that's certainly possible in the Scottish case. The other thing I wonder about is, so the Yes side had, the two outstanding politicians in Scotland at that time, Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, making the case for Yes. But Alex Salmond was the preeminent figure. And at that time, very effective and charismatic politician. But I almost wonder if you switched them round and had Nicola Sturgeon as the primary face, of the Yes campaign, if that might have played better with some of these voters than Salmond. I think Salmond also had a polarising effect. I mean, obviously lots of things then came out about Alex Salmond that we don't need to go into.
And indeed about Nicola Sturgeon. But we've got to get back into 2014 where they were, as you said, they were absolutely dominant figures, weren't they? But she was the sober one, essentially. I mean, not literally, or maybe literally, I don't know, but came across as the pragmatist.
Exactly. I think could have been a more compelling figurehead or more likely to win over those voters who were sceptical anyway, whereas there was a sort of bombasticism, I suppose, about Alex Salmond that again put off some of these wavering voters. One of the interesting facts about the psephology of the referendum is that voters who were born in Scotland voted yes overall. That seems to be the finding. So, i.e., one of the things that made a difference to the vote were voters who were born outside of Scotland and had moved to Scotland, predominantly from England, presumably, but also from other countries. They had a decisive role in the outcome of the referendum. And that is something that, to the credit of Scottish nationalism, that has never been something that has been discussed or made an issue of. You could imagine a much more ethnic nationalism taking that very striking finding in a very unpleasant and difficult direction. But that has never really been discussed or made an issue of in Scottish politics since then.
And of course, there was a question, as with all referendums, because in the British system, there are no rules about referendums. They have to be legislated for on an ad hoc basis. What is the electorate here? And it was people resident in Scotland. I don't think there's any plausible scenario in which you could have had a nativist electorate. It wouldn't have flown. You couldn't have said, you've got to produce your birth certificate to get a vote. That would have been toxic. Nor the other scenario, which some people mischievously advocated, which is let the English vote too, because they'll be happy to let Scotland go. Probably in the end, the electorate was the only one that was plausible to get a political consensus for this referendum. But I think from all the things that you've said, when I look back on it now, there is a scenario in which this could have come out differently. A lot of it is quite contingent. That 10-point gap at the end is probably at the upper end of what was possible here, and there was quite a lot of room the other way. So I don't think we have to agree what the different bits are you have to tweak to get the different outcome, but I think you can tweak it to get a different outcome. What would have happened? We can't know this, but there is the day after question, and then there are the longer term questions. So one of the day after questions that comes straight to mind to me is, would it have brought down the UK government? Because Brexit did. I think to some people's surprise, Cameron just resigned the next day and seemed to have an understanding that to lose a vote, an almost earlier version of politics, a sort of almost Victorian or Edwardian understanding of politics, that to lose a vote of this magnitude means that you can no longer continue as Prime Minister. Do you think it would have, when you play it out in your mind, do you see Cameron appearing outside Downing Street the next day and tendering his resignation?
I think if I had to jump one way or the other, I would be inclined to think that probably he would have had to resign, whether the next day or eventually. I think the blow to the government and to the prestige of the government would be so huge, and it would be such an enormous task that would then be set to give effect to the referendum. At a minimum, the government would have been in a lot of trouble politically, and there would have been a lot of questions, as there were after the Brexit referendum, about why it was a good idea to hold this referendum and whose idea was it. And, with that, the buck would probably have to stop with Cameron, because he didn't have to concede this referendum. I mean, it was their political decision that this was a fight they could win, and they could win easily. And they thought it would be a good opportunity to put the Scottish National Party back in their box. And if that gamble failed, I would find it very difficult to imagine him being able to hang around for very long.
And one of the signs it wasn't a great piece of political calculation is it failed anyway, because it didn't put the SNP back in its box. The SNP, for a while anyway, used defeat in this referendum to strengthen its position. There is also an irony here, which is one of the things I find hardest to unravel. So there is a view of Scottish independence taken in the round, which is to take Scotland out of the UK's political settlement, is to remove a section of the electorate who have become, it's not always been the case, but post-Thatcher have become very unlikely to support a Tory administration in Westminster. It fluctuates from having no seats or one seat to having a few more than that. But on the whole, either the SNP or Labour have dominated in Scotland. So taking Scotland out strengthens the Tory position if you're left with England and Wales, leave Northern Ireland out of it. But it would have been such a blow to conservatism to the Tory party, the Conservative and Unionist Party. The end of the Union would have been, for many Conservatives, a catastrophe, a sort of existential moment. So on one pragmatic level, taking Scotland out of the UK leaves a Tory country, which is England plus Wales, intact. On the other hand, it's a catastrophe for conservatism. And I don't know what happens at that point. I find it hard actually to play it out. Brexit is different. Brexit doesn't have quite that dynamic. But this one looks like it does pull in two very different directions.
Yes. I mean, I suppose you could say that holding the referendum and narrowly losing it, did have some political advantages to the Conservative Party in the sort of timeline we live in the sense that it did then significantly weaken the Labour Party and make it much more difficult for the Labour Party to win subsequent elections because it sort of boosted the SNP, but not by enough to cause independence, but by enough to take apart the Labour Party's electoral coalition in Scotland. And so there was definitely a few years after the referendum when it seemed that both for the SNP and the Conservative Party, things had worked out quite well because, they had the kind of the scenario in which they could face off against each other and Labour didn't have a voice in the debate in Scotland. So I suppose, there is that sort of narrow party politics, I suppose, that you could say maybe did work out for Cameron and Osborne, at least for a while. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it does pose a sort of huge question about what is conservatism and how to rethink conservatism if Scottish independence comes about. I suppose there's a parallel with decolonisation and the end of empire, which was, similarly, you might think a kind of existential, shattering ideological blow to conservatism in England. But in the end, they managed to bounce back from that quite well and come up with a sort of more domestically focused politics that brushed over it. And I suppose one wonders if there might have been a similar process there would have been, sadness and unhappiness for a time, but a sort of refocused conservative politics around Englishness might well have, played out quite well for the Conservative Party in the medium term.
And if it was Englishness, do you think Wales would have, in the end, had to go? I mean, it's so hard to imagine the next steps, but being Wales with England just squatting there next to you without even Scotland as, I don't know, a consolation or a counterbalance, or at least a view that there's something more going on here than just a form of domination. Independence for Wales has never had the traction that Scottish independence has had. But nonetheless, it's a very odd polity that you're left with. Northern Ireland, maybe we can come on to what might have happened there, but if you bracket Northern Ireland for now, it's an odd state that you're left with, England plus Wales. It's hard to see it being sustainable in the medium term, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's questions, the sort of questions within Wales about what's the balance of opinion within Wales and how far Scotland becoming independent would actually make a difference to how Welsh politics plays out. I mean, the way that Welsh opinion works at the moment, there's been a sort of limited support for forms of nationalism and only very limited support for forms of separatist nationalism. But yeah, I think that, the question would be, would it have been emboldened or enhanced in its support had Scotland become independent? I mean, I guess there's a sort of narrative you can start to tell, isn't there? Which some people tell already. I mean, this is part of the narrative that the Scottish nationalists tell at the moment, which is to say that there was this construct called, British Empire and the United Kingdom that has over time unravelled, that there was the loss of empire, Ireland departed, Scotland is the next one to go, and these dominoes will keep falling because there's something artificial and ramshackle about this constitutional structure that's called the United Kingdom. It's not a real, authentic national identity. It's a kind of synthetic national identity. And so in the end, these constituent parts will assert themselves.
Even though 300 years is a pretty long time to 300 plus years, I mean, the empire and everything that went with it, but the union itself, for a ramshackle artificial construct, it's a lot longer lasting than some of the more ethnically based or nativist constructs. I mean, that's one of the things about the thought of Scottish independence, which is there is a natural quality to it. The UK is this arbitrary thing, and Scotland is a nation in the way that the UK isn't. I think a lot of Scottish people would believe that. And yet the thing that isn't a nation in the history of the world is one of the most, however you want to frame it, durable and, on some measures, successful polities of them all, which suggests there's something to be said for the artificial version.
Yes, I mean, I think the sort of question that Scottish nationalism poses, I suppose, to that is to ask what is the basis of that identity, that shared British identity. And the argument that's made is that it used to be one thing, which was Protestantism and imperialism, and that worked for a while. And then Protestantism and imperialism no longer became the basis of British identity. And then, sort of circa middle of the 20th century, maybe you have the sort of welfare state or projects of social democracy or something is the basis of British identity, the NHS, the sort of building of the welfare state. And then that also starts to lose purchase as you move into the Thatcher period, the late 20th century, the rise of as Scottish nationalists would put it, a more right-wing UK state based around free market economics, and that had taken away one of the remaining constituent building blocks of that identity. And so you're left with not very much to hang these separate nations together. And I think that, I mean, there was something in that, in the sense that clearly the No campaign found it very difficult to get hold of what is the case for the union that they're trying to make that would reach people. And they just about got there with the sort of sense of uncertainty, economic loss. But it wasn't always a very inspiring tale, the one that they told during the referendum campaign.
It's almost impossible to answer this, but on those what would have happened the day after questions, where do you think the real tension would have been? Where would have been the cliff edge politics? For the foreseeable future, Scotland would have remained using the pound sterling as its currency, and therefore it would have had to negotiate an arrangement with the Westminster government, with the Bank of England. There would have had to be an understanding that would presumably have been a long drawn-out process. The politics around it would have been fraught, but it wouldn't, I think, have precipitated any kind of economic collapse. I don't think there would have been a loss of confidence in sterling, I don't think, around that. The border question presumably would have been pragmatically handled for quite a while. The Queen was going to remain head of state. There was the question about Trident. You know, some of these things would have been real pressure points. But do you have a feeling that there's anything that would have flared up straight away? Is there something which would have, given some people pause the next day? Or actually, is all of this capable of being worked out? Is all of this actually something that where the real question doesn't have to be answered the next day?
I think it partly depends on what the UK negotiating position is and how the UK, or the rest of the UK, I should say, approached the negotiations. What the remainder of the UK approached the negotiations, in the sense that clearly there would have been a current of opinion within England, certainly, that would have been, if not seeking a punitive settlement, would have said, well, okay, they've decided to go, why should we give them anything? And I can imagine that being quite an influential body of opinion, particularly within the Conservative Party from the day after. And so if a very hard negotiating stance is taken, you have a replication of the kind of post-Brexit asymmetry of power, in the sense that the people negotiating for Scottish independence had very few cards to play. And I think one of the real cards they had to play, as I understand it anyway, is the nuclear weapon bases in Scotland, in the sense that it seems very, very difficult to find a new place for those nuclear weapons to go. And so the UK state would have had a very, very keen interest in hanging on to those bases where they are, at least for the foreseeable future. And so that would be something that an independent Scotland could trade for, say, a currency union. But the political pain that would have caused to the supporters of Scottish independence would have been considerable, because one of the arguments that was used by the left-wing supporters of independence was that independence was about removing nuclear weapons from Scottish soil. So it would have required huge difficulties in managing the pro-independence coalition. But, is something solid that the UK would actually want from an independent Scotland, that they could probably have used to trade for a currency union if that's what they wanted, or support for membership of the EU. I mean, I think given goodwill, there are lots of ways in which these things could be worked out. But I think the question is, would there have been goodwill in the circumstances following the referendum? I think the other immediate issue that would have confronted the UK system is, how would the 2015 general election have worked? In that would have had to happen fairly swiftly after the referendum took place. What is the status of the Scottish MPs that are elected during that campaign, and what would be the arguments that would take up that campaign? It's possible that actually in that timeline, the arguments that would have constituted the 2015 election campaign might have looked quite similar to the ones that actually did constitute the 2015 election, in the sense that you might have had the Conservatives running on well, we're not going to hand over a lot of extra money to the Scots, which is, one of the things that they did campaign on in 2015. So it's possible you might have had a broadly similar campaign that would have resulted in the Conservatives, winning again, perhaps not with Cameron as the leader, perhaps with Theresa May as the leader or someone else.
Although it would have been harder to run the campaign with one of its lines of attack on Labour, that poster with Ed Miliband in Alex Salmond's pocket, and the idea that SNP MPs would prop up a Labour government. That's the one thing that would have been pulled out of the Conservative armoury, presumably. I mean, who knows? But there would have been a different version, which would have been, if you elect a Labour government, they're going to sell out to the SNP. They're going to be soft on this, and we're going to be hard as nails. And that actually might have been just as effective. It would have been a fascinating campaign. I mean, one of the really intriguing counterfactuals here is, I think, with Scottish independence, you don't get Brexit, partly because the Cameron government would have fallen, and maybe a Tory government would have won an outright majority with a manifesto that promised a referendum on Brexit, but that's quite a big contingency. You would have much more nervousness among the political class about another referendum. Part of the reason they went for the Brexit referendum is the Scottish one made them complacent. It made Cameron and Osborne complacent. They thought they had a template for how you run these things, which is it's pragmatic, it's a scare campaign, you warn people about the economic costs, they flirt with the radical option, and then they fall back to the status quo. Turned out that was wrong. But they wouldn't have believed that if they'd lost the Scottish independence referendum anyway. The government would have fallen. Maybe it would have emboldened the electorate to think we're permitted to do these things, but it might have had the opposite effect, which is it would have been so messy by that point. It would have made it harder to run a Brexit campaign without focusing on the practicalities of what we're going to do, how are we going to negotiate this, what does it mean for the UK? The Northern Irish question, which was just had a blanket thrown over it in the Brexit campaign, would have been unavoidable because Northern Ireland would have become a live issue in UK politics anyway. I think, for what it's worth, that yes to Scottish independence means no to Brexit.
I agree. I think it's very difficult to imagine there being bandwidth in the political system for anything that looks like a Brexit referendum in the immediate future after a yes to independence. I mean, there's so many things would have to be sorted out and would preoccupy the attention of the state and the political system. I find it hard to imagine a Brexit referendum happening on the timescale that we had it anyway. Who knows if it would have come later. I suppose one consequence of that is it does make Scottish independence a bit easier if Brexit doesn't happen, because if the rest of the UK and the independent Scotland get to be in the EU, or at least an independent Scotland gets to be in the European single market, that makes some of the economic transition less problematic than it would be now in our timeline if were Scottish independence to come about now, and the sort of premise of that Scottish independence was Scotland would become a member of the EU. So it would simplify some things.
And yet it is part of that wider ironic story, which is Scotland leaving creates a pro-Brexit nation, because Scotland famously, notoriously, voted to remain in the referendum. England voted pretty decisively to leave, and England plus Wales is still a clear majority to leave. So you take Scotland out, you take the most Remainy part out of the UK. Nonetheless, probably you don't get Brexit, at least not in the short term. I think in the medium term, then it would have been a very different story. I think England, particularly England with Wales drifting away, if your longer historical narrative plays out and you're left with the rump, which is back with England, you do get a nation which I think is going to be increasingly uncomfortable with its membership of the European Union. But it's a 10-year, 20-year story. We're probably not there yet. It's the 10th anniversary of Scottish independence. I would be amazed if that vote had gone differently, that now we would have had a Brexit referendum that led to a Brexit vote. I still think it would be at some point in the future. And it's also the case that the Conservative Party might have found a winning formula out of this mess, but it would almost certainly have had some struggles over the intervening period. And it might have been not this year, but earlier than this year, that a Labour government was back in Westminster. So you do get a very, very different, not just British, but European political story with Scottish independence.
I guess the other question is what would then be happening in Scotland in this time? And there, the counterfactual is what kind of Scottish state would have emerged? What would it have looked like? What would have the economic transition been like for people in Scotland? And how hard would it have been to set up a new state and deal with the deficit in public spending and all those kind of difficult economic issues that to some extent the Yes campaign danced around during the referendum campaign, and what the attitude of people within Scotland to that would have been. I mean, I suppose one thought I had when I was thinking about this was that maybe if you had a very narrow yes vote, maybe in Scotland it would be a bit like the post-Brexit period. There'd be a real problem with losers' consent within Scotland. Would there be a kind of, Remain movement, second referendum movement that started within Scotland? I mean, I think reflecting on that, though, I'm inclined to think there probably would have been a bump in support for independence, even among people who didn't vote for it, because I think even people who voted no to independence, found something to admire in the aspiration. They weren't completely alienated by the idea, whereas I think with Remain and Leave, I don't think Remainers found anything to admire in Leave. There was nothing they could kind of reconcile themselves to as a sort of great adventure that they wanted to be part of, whereas the idea of starting a new Scottish state, it does have a sort of allure to it that I think maybe some of the no voters might have been happy to get behind if that was the democratic decision.
And I feel psychologically when individuals or people are granted independence, which is a form of freedom, it's a while before they want to give it back. You don't tend to want to give it back straight away, not least because there is a sort of tail between your legs quality to giving it back. You're returning to a situation in which you are then once again dependent. You're not independent, you're dependent on people that you have brushed off. And that's a very uncomfortable position to be in the same way, I have no idea what a second EU referendum would have been like. But there is a psychological barrier to overcome. The situation has changed. The psychology of the situation has changed to be handing it back once you've made your break for freedom. And also in the UK context, the thing about these referendums is they are sold as once in a generation decision-making processes. In some countries, like in New Zealand, they have a complex process where referendums have to be ratified by further referendums and buyer's remorse is built into the system. We don't have that. And it seems like it's quite a big leap, actually, unless there's genuine civil disobedience and a refusal to endorse the legitimacy of this new state, which I find almost impossible to imagine unless there was complete breakdown, but there wouldn't be. I mean, I just don't think there would have been that kind of breakdown. So, yeah, I tend to think it would have stuck. I mean, I think we would still be there now, don't you? Scotland would still be independent.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the voters that I was talking about, who were the swing voters who were polled by the No campaign, who didn't feel any particular attachment to Britishness and were kind of curious about independence, I think they could have been reconciled to the project of independence had that been the decision. In the polling booth on the day, they felt, well, maybe the economic risks aren't worth pursuing, but given the result, there is a kind of excitement and adventure to this idea of starting a new Scottish state that probably would have energised the electorate and kind of mobilised a sense of nation building, much more so than in the Brexit case, which again I think is different in all sorts of ways.
So as a last question, the biggest sort of counterfactual issue here of all, which is what would it have meant for the wider world? Because this would have been a really dramatic event. And it's hard to think of a parallel to it. So it's not like the end of Czechoslovakia, a kind of mutually agreed, relatively friendly divorce between two countries that had been joined within living memory. I think that's right in the case of Czechoslovakia, at least some people's living memory. We're talking about the end of an incredibly long-standing dominant feature of world politics. Once the dominant power in the world, the Anglo-Scottish Union was the basis of British domination of the globe for a period. People would have been fascinated by it, and they would have held it up as an example. So from 2014 to now, Scottish independence would have become emblematic of all sorts of things. And it could have been emblematic of two very different kinds of things, one of which is of freedom, of independence. Go for it, people, Catalonia, whoever it is. A sort of inspiring story. And on the other hand, it could have been a warning, right? A warning in relation to Brexit, a warning in relation to all sorts of things. On the cusp of this period of pretty dramatic, you might say wild election results. If this one had been right at the beginning of that sequence, it might have had a sobering effect, particularly if it had got very messy and complicated and difficult. Do you have a feeling of which? I mean, it probably would have been both, right? It depends on circumstances, whether you point to Scotland as your lodestar or as your great warning of the risks of doing something stupid. But what do you think the symbolic meaning of Scottish independence would be 10 years on if it had happened?
Yeah, definitely part of the buzz of the referendum campaign for people in Scotland was that it seemed like, the world's attention was focused on Scotland for those few weeks. Scotland was the centre of the political universe. There were, journalists pouring in from all over the world to see what was happening. And it was a kind of heady experience that the sort of Scotland was this world phenomenon that needs to be covered. So I think it, as you say, I mean, it would have been an unbelievably dramatic and emblematic moment. Obviously, would have been a huge blow to the prestige and the geopolitical standing of the UK in the first instance. It would also then raise the question, as you say, for other multinational states, whether this is a kind of pathway that they want to go down. So Canada and Quebec and Spain and Catalonia, the obvious examples. So I think all of those would be kind of big signals that people would be interested in. I guess in terms of the pathways and what happens, I suppose it depends what kind of Scotland would emerge, how easy it would be for Scotland to set itself up as an independent state and how successful it becomes. I mean, there's a sort of, there's a utopian side to Scottish nationalism. I mean, part of the utopianism of Scottish nationalism was that the creation of a new Scottish state would be a sort of moment in a new kind of left-wing egalitarian politics, that you'd end up with a Scottish state that would be, in some sense, social democratic, would have a more open immigration policy, would be more pluralistic and democratic. And so that was the intention behind the yes vote. I mean, I suppose it's more likely that the kind of Scottish state that would emerge would look a bit like Ireland or, another small liberal market-based state. And so maybe there's a sense in which Scotland just ends up being a regular country, just like lots of other small countries, and doesn't end up being a beacon or a signal to anyone. But I think the novelty of it, the kind of, that's why it was a sort of incredibly dramatic experience, I guess, the last few weeks of the referendum campaign, because it just seemed unbelievable that it might happen, that something, that a sort of developed democratic state would fall apart. And it just, it's really, really difficult to do that, and make that happen. And had that happened, as you say, it raises all sorts of questions about what next and how best to organise societies and decentralisation and all of those things.
And given that it didn't happen, how much of that future has now been foreclosed? Because again, with all of these things, it pulls in two different directions. So we are now in the era where it doesn't seem so extraordinary, the thought that, say, Scotland would vote for independence because the UK voted to leave the European Union and Trump got elected president of the United States. These things that really are quite outlandish, as seen from 2014, are now facts of life. These things happen. And Scottish independence feels in some ways less outlandish than at least one of those two scenarios. I'll leave people to guess which one I'm referring to. But on the other hand, the conditions for another referendum are not at all promising. And for now, at least, not least with the Labour government in Westminster, Labour government which has revived in Scotland, the problems that the SNP has had, not just Alex Salmond but Nicola Sturgeon's falls from grace, we seem a long way out from another referendum, notwithstanding the fact that the circumstances in which such a referendum might be won seem more promising to me in some ways than they were in 2014. There is more permission, however that's construed, to do these kinds of things. And some of those younger voters are a bit older, but many of them are still pro-independence. Some of those older voters are no longer with us. But there's not going to be another referendum. So, in a way, 2014 did shut off a whole path of history.
Yeah, it was an opportunity of a kind that you don't get very often, that's for sure. I think a lot of the leaders of the SNP were very conscious of that, which is why they were desperate to win the referendum, because it may turn out to be unrepeatable, having a referendum that was agreed to by the government in London. One of the difficulties they had in that referendum was that they didn't really have a movement. It was only the campaign itself that conjured into being a movement that was pro-independence and popularised the idea of independence in a way that had never been popularised before. And so they were coming from a long way behind, and they just fell slightly short. But they were left then with a much more mobilised pro-independence movement and balance of opinion within Scotland than had ever existed before. And as you say, the sort of demographic skew of that opinion means that slowly over time, you might expect the support for independence to keep ticking up. But there is no mechanism to give voice to that at the moment, since the UK government has no interest in agreeing to a referendum. And I suppose the only scenario in which you could imagine it happening is if there's just a continual, strong and palpable rise in support for independence to the point at which opinion polls start showing very substantial majorities for it, at which point I think there would be quite a lot of pressure on the UK government to grant another referendum. I mean, at the moment, opinion polls are very finely balanced. It's about 50-50. Sometimes they tick up and show more support for independence over 50%, but, it seems to be about a kind of 50-50 split at the moment. If that support for independence kept growing, then there would be pressure for another referendum, I think. But a lot of that depends on how UK politics plays out. I think Labour in office now have an opportunity to try and establish a different kind of Britishness, a sort of more Gordon Brownish pulling and sharing kind of Britishness. And if they can point to a concrete record of social and economic reform, to some extent that would take the sting out of the Scottish nationalist argument, which is that politics from Westminster is always right-wing and neoliberal. But that then means there is actually quite a lot of pressure and responsibility, I would say, on the Labour government now to do that. Whether they can do that is an open question. And so I think that, how the next few years play out is going to be quite significant for what happens in Scotland and for Scottish independence. Because if the Labour period in government turns out to be short-lived and the Conservatives return to office with very little support in Scotland, I think a lot of these issues will sort of roar back to the front of politics again.
Conservatives return to office and or Nigel Farage becomes the dominant figure in Westminster politics, which is not impossible, then you do get a very, very different scenario. And also, as you said at the beginning, if you take a step back, before the 2014 campaign, 35 to 40% of people were in favour of independence. Here we are 10 years later, and it's 45 to 50. The direction of travel looks like it's only going one way.
Yeah, and especially with the demographic tailwinds that support for independence enjoys. And I suppose, it's always hard to know with these demographic arguments whether that will turn out to be the case over time, because there is always the possibility that politics might change people's preferences. They're not set in stone. And so, a successful period of centre-left government in the UK along the lines that the kind of Starmer government has outlined, maybe that is enough to kind of diffuse this for a while anyway. But if there is another swing to the right in UK politics, then I think all bets are off on Scottish independence. So it is quite a fragile settlement at the moment in that sense. And I'm sure there's still a lot of drama to come in this story.
Do hope you've enjoyed this series of What Ifs. I've really enjoyed making them. And a reminder that there is a bonus episode, the second part of my conversation with Chris Clark about the origins of the First World War and how it might have been avoided, is available on PPF Plus. To subscribe, you just go to ppfideas.com, our new website, and it's very easy to join. We're about to start a new series. I'm going to be talking to Shannon Vallor, the philosopher and author of the recent book, The AI Mirror, about how we think about thinking machines. We're going to be exploring the history in film, in fiction, in philosophy, of thinking about what it would mean for things that aren't human to think like us. And we're going to be starting with a film, Fritz Lang's masterpiece, Metropolis. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.